Our approaches to consciousness, of course, are influenced by the conceptual apparatus that we're using, by the language that we're using. And so hieroglyphic language really opens up a window to think about and understand consciousness in a very particular way. So the glyphs are not only narrating or providing a certain kind of narrative content, but it's also embodying a very complex and integrated view of consciousness itself.
This panel is one that is especially near and dear to my heart because it is about bringing the resources of ancient wisdom traditions to bear on contemporary questions, such as the question of consciousness, and more specifically, the riches of ancient Egypt. In the past 2 years, I've had the great privilege of teaching courses on ancient Egyptian Hermeticism and alchemy, and ancient Egyptian solar theology. So it's a great privilege for me to introduce these two colleagues from whom I have learned already so much and look forward to learning so much more. These are two friends and colleagues, in the case of Marques, an old friend and colleague, and in the case of Mervat, a more recent friend and colleague. So we're going to give the floor first to Mervat and then Marques, but first allow me to introduce them both. Dr. Mervat Nasser spent her career in the UK as a clinical psychiatrist, but alongside that, she studied Egyptology and has more recently founded the new Hermopolis Center in Middle Egypt. So, thank you, Mervat, for accepting our invitation. And Dr. Marques Redd and I have known each other for several years. We've been entangled at the Esalen Institute for years. And Marques is a remarkable young man. I can say young because you're younger than I am. But Marques is a traditional African cosmologist, an artist, and the co-founder of the nonprofit organization Rainbow Serpent. I've seen a number of the projects that Marques has spearheaded. They're truly remarkable. I'm sort of in awe of his energy, and I don't know if polymath has a noun, polymathery. I feel like I should know that noun. But in any case, whatever that noun is, this man exemplifies it. And I've learned so much from him already about ancient Egyptian traditions, and I'm delighted that he accepted our invitation to speak from his own deep learning in that field. So without further ado, we'll hear from Mervat, Marques. I will ask a few questions to try to link the two, and then we'll open it up to your questions and comments.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I want to thank Charlie very much for recommending me and for all the people who have given me the privilege and the honor to be with you. I'm going to talk about Hermetic philosophy and Hermetic consciousness in relation to Jung. But we have to remember that we are in the land of Sir Walter Scott, who was the first to translate the Hermetica into English. And there are 4 huge volumes, although, of course, the emphasis at that time was on Platonism and New Platonism, and there wasn't a lot of mention of the ancient Egyptian heritage in it, although in fact it is a culmination of an ancient Egyptian way of thinking. Yes, it probably was produced in Hellenistic Egypt, but it has a lot to do with the ancient Egyptian way of thinking, especially the issue of complementarity and the fusion and the reconciliation of of opposing forces. This thing about the logic, the Greek logic doesn't allow a middle third. So, but the Egyptian logic allows a middle third, and we are actually talking about an integrated third that we need to reach, an integrated consciousness. So I'm going to mention about the roots of the Hermetic philosophy and Hermetic consciousness, and we'll link it as we go along with Jung perspective on consciousness. Consciousness, by definition, in any dictionary, it says being aware, having cognitive faculties that I exist, and I'm aware of the existence of others around me and the existence of things. This is simply consciousness. But as we know from the beginning of this amazing symposium till today, that it is more intriguing than that, and it is more problematic than that, and there is not a simple answer for what we mean by consciousness. Hermetic consciousness is an integral awareness of the outer and the inner spiritual being. And I use being more than consciousness, but we will come to that as we go along. The Jungian consciousness actually acknowledges the consciousness that we are all aware of, and we can easily define that it is not special to any one of us, is really being aware, simply. But there is another consciousness that is inside us that we are not fully conscious of. So it is the unconsciousness, and this is actually the result of our ancestral heritage. Which he called archetypal unconsciousness or collective unconsciousness, and it is primarily rooted in ancient mythology. So I put here that the Jungian consciousness is consciousness, the simplistic one, and the collective unconscious, that is, both are awaiting integration. So the collective unconscious, as Carl Jung says, it is the way we took into ourselves the mythological motives and the primordial images of past civilizations and past cultures. And this saying is actually very interesting because it links consciousness with memory and education or learning. And this is a big subject, and maybe it is a theme for another symposium, the link between consciousness and memory. Jung was asked, why do dreams speak such an obscure language? And Jung replied, it doesn't speak an obscure language, it speaks a forgotten language that we no longer understand. So actually, in being conscious of what is inside us, we need to remember. And I liked, because the whole contributions in this symposium, actually they feed into each other. And we talked about the selection from our memory, that memory is not something, it's not a storehouse. We choose from it what we need to remember or what we want to remember, and this is a conscious decision. Mythology, if we go to Egyptian mythology, of course, most people are aware of Greek mythology, but hardly anyone is aware of Egyptian mythology. There are two basic mythological stories, which is the super story or the mega story. One is from the city of the sun, or the Heliopolis, as the Greeks called it afterwards, and it's called the Ennead. It's 9 forces. And another one that comes from Hermopolis, which is called the Ogdoad, the 8. So there is an 8 and 9. I'm not obviously going to give this mythology its due because we don't have the time, but just to say that we start the Heliopolitan one, it starts with atom or Ra, the sun. And Sheila was just saying about photo creation and photosensitivity and photosynthesis and all that. So the sun is the beginning of everything, and the sun has a dormant state and non-dormant state, and rising. It's rising and setting. It actually encapsulates life and death and becoming. So the Egyptians had 3 stages to it. That just the sun in its inert state, dormant state is non-being, because being and non-being were one and the same thing, and also becoming, because they are all intertwined. The 3 are intertwined. We cannot be without becoming, and we cannot be without non-being. So there is always a non-being at the very beginning. And you can see that there is the symbols of Ra and Khepri. Atom is the static one, and then you have the scarab. And you see this picture of the scarab man, how the man is coming out of the scarab, because the word scarab itself in ancient Egypt means becoming. So we are constantly able to become with every morning, because the scarab is the symbol of the rising sun. So with every morning, we have a chance of becoming. And this is the coffin text, which shows how the Hermetic was, as I said, a culmination of ancient Egyptian thought. It says, I was alone with the primeval ocean in the inertness, floating between 2 waters, totally inert, and it was my son, life, that roused my spirit, who made my heart live and gathered my inert members. So someone was saying that consciousness is life. So it's life that gives us this sense of awareness. Being alive is being aware of what goes around us. Obviously that requires more explanation. But then this one, which was Atom, Ra, he is supposed to have given birth to 2, Geb and Nut, heaven and earth. And ancient Egypt, earth is man, and heaven is a woman. And she is the one who swallows the sun into her belly during the night, and then gives birth to the sun every day. She is the mother of the gods, so she is actually is more important than the god himself. So heaven is and that shows in that we are partly heaven and partly earth. So there is a heavenly part and an earthly part. But Ra got angry because apparently, according to the myth, they fell in love with each other, and he didn't tell him. And he had to separate them. But before separating them, Thoth, who became later on in Greek times Hermes, intervened and played a trick with the moon and got 4 days out of the moon for the first family to be born. And that's why there is a difference between the lunar calendar and the solar calendar of 4 days. But then heaven became heaven and earth became earth, but still we have the 2 ingredients inside us. So this idea of the oneness, which again Sheila mentioned, it is the oneness of the very creation and the very beginning, and this is our struggle in life, is to get back to this oneness. So it is the oneness we start with and the oneness that we aspire to. But there is a division, so the one became 2. This is an Egyptian expression for life, which means the beginning of a dialectic, the beginning of a strife, the beginning of of two forces, the beginning of two things. So that is, it's a beautiful description that life is about a struggle, life is about a strife between two forces, and you have to find a way out of these two forces. The same applies after that. The second couple was, I said the first family was 4, Isis and Osiris. I'm sure that not all of you are aware of all these names. And Set and Nephthys. This is the first family. But the first couple is Isis and Osiris, because Osiris, who is actually supposedly Christ, really, because in Coptic Egypt and then, of course, in Christianity, he became almost the divine savior. He's the one who was killed almost out of treachery and for the sake of humanity, although there isn't really vice or evil in ancient Egypt. But anyway, this is the kind of the sacred marriage or the divine marriage between Isis and Osiris, or the Anima or Animus according to Jung, but they had to be separated, and in the process of living, we have to combine them again. According to the ancient Egyptian myth, Set, who is his brother, had him killed and cut him into pieces, and they were scattered all over Egypt. And then Isis collected the pieces and made a hole out of it, but then he became the god of the underworld. And she had an immaculate conception of Horus. This is actually how Osiris has been cut into pieces, and Isis and Nephthys are helping each other to put his pieces together. So it is the dismembering of the body and then the remembering, which is putting again things together after fragmentation. Then he became the symbol of death and rebirth, because he comes with every spring, with the crops. He is really the land, he is earth, because every part of Egypt became full of corn then, and that is the beauty, that is we never die. We are the cycle of life, as in Lion King, which actually was taken from this. And it says in this, again it is coffin text, it says, I enter in and reappear through you. I decay in you, I grow in you. The gods are living in me, for I live and grow in the corn that sustains the honored ones. Then Isis gives birth to Horus. And Horus is supposed to take revenge for the death of his father, but we have to remember that Set is his brother. So the two sides, evil and good, are the two sides of the same coin. And would he get rid of evil? Would he get rid of Set? Is there a possibility that we could get rid of the bad thing in life? Or the answer is not to get rid of things, is actually to integrate everything in life into one. Because Set is supposed to be the shadow. He could be the shadow of Osiris, he could be the shadow of Horus. So he's the dark side of the self, and we have to incorporate the dark side of ourselves. You can see how many concepts, Jungian concepts, are actually applicable to this primal myth. And then again, we have Thoth, who became later on Hermes. He, in the fight with Set, because everyone told him he has got right, he has to fight Set, he loses his eye in the middle of the fight. And the restorer of the eye, or the healer, or the ultimate inside giver, because he gives back him an eye, but an all-seeing eye, an eye that can see properly, which is from the inside. So that's the first connection between sight and inside. The eye giver, which is really the position of thought, because it's wisdom. And of course, no one wins. because no one wins. It is a dialectic. It will continue forever. In the end, they are reconciled, and you can see that Set and Horus, they are tying the two sides of the Nile, but they are putting their feet almost like the potter's wheel on the trachea that leads to the lungs. So we cannot breathe, we cannot have life without reconciliation, without bringing together the opposing forces. So this is the mythological substrate for the Hermetic philosophy. The Hermetic philosophy came later in fragments and in many books. Many people just attribute it to the Hermetica. The Hermetica is just one manuscripts, or there are some fragments that were recovered in the city of Alexandria, and they were mostly in Greek, and in the 2nd century. But they go back to earlier times, because there are other manuscripts. There is the Book of Thought that is also available in fragments and has been translated recently. It was subject to many translations, but because it is extremely difficult and it is in several fragments, but they are in many museums all over the world. And there is the Emerald Tablet, which of course was translated long before the Hermetica, which was translated at the time of the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance. And the Emerald Tablet is about alchemy, is about transformation. So that is, but the one that showed how the Hermetica is related to ancient Egypt was the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, which are the Gnostic manuscripts. And so all of them talk about things like the pursuit of knowledge, about self-gnosis, about self-integration and fusion, and self-alchemy. And these are the things that Jung also talked about, because the Hermetic Jung has got a book about the archetypes, which come from the mythological substrate. And then he has the Gnostic Jung, so he talked about Gnosticism, because we have to employ active imagination to perform the concepts of ourselves out of this initial mythical substrate. And then there is the alchemy, so you transmute all these things into yourself, into the furnace of life, and become yourself. You don't become yourself as a distinctive being. You are able only to join the two opposing forces within you, or at least acknowledge them. But you become yourself when you find your own uniqueness. And this is why I am fond of the existential Jung. I'm not really fond of very much, I like him, of archetypal Jung or alchemical Jung. I'm more interested in his undiscovered self, which were all the existential pioneers, and one of them was Jung. They all came about after all the savagery of the Second World War. It's actually found ways of reconciling with this harshness of life and the cruelty of life. So there is the prefigured self, which is the Gnostic symbols, and then active imagination allows you to form something out of these mythical constructs. And then there is the union through alchemy of the unconscious and the conscious. And then there is the individuation, which is the identification with the Savior, with the sacred Savior, because you become God within you. So you become an individual, you become unique. And this is searching for your uniqueness. And this is, again, he says, the alchemical operations were real, only this reality was not physical but psychological. And then he says, the self then functions as a union of opposites and thus constitutes the most immediate experience of the divine, which it is psychologically possible to imagine. then with the undiscovered self, he says, you know, the looking outward has got to be turned into looking into oneself. Discovering yourself provides you with all you are, were meant to be, and all you are living from and for. So the purpose and the mission of your life. This is a quote from the Hermetica, which says, listen, every human heart, immerse yourself in mind and recognize the purpose of your birth. And Jung says almost the same. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light of meaning in the darkness of mere being. So that is the reason why I had to go to the land that is supposedly the land of thought, or Hermes, and the one who is supposed to be the author of all these manuscripts, and who's also played an important role in the Ennead, the Heliopolitan, as well as the Hermopolitan myth. So he's like Ra, he's the shadow of Ra, or the deputy of Ra. And to try to revive this ancient city. Of course, this is a grand thing, and what I did was just an eco-village in the same land, and it's very close to the ancient site and ruins. This is where it is. It is on the map in the middle of Egypt, very close to Amarna, where Akhenaten and Nefertiti are. And it couldn't have been a coincidence that he chose to have this his city there, but that's a long story. And of course, the Rosicrucians have great importance, give great importance to this site. We have Asyut as well, or Lycopolis, where Plotinus and the new Platonism started, but of course it grew in Alexandria after that. So this county where ancient Hermopolis was, it used to be called the county of the rabbit, or Winnet. And Winnet in ancient Egyptian or in hieroglyphs means being. So I'm not really making all that up. It is actually the land of being. This is and to dwell in Winnet, this is in the Book of the Dead, or what we call the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which is the better name for it. And the real name. To dwell in Winnet means to live renewed, revitalized, and to be forever reborn. And we find the same. It's the rabbit usually encircled within the Ouroboros, and we find the Ouroboros is one of the Jungian symbolism, and he says exactly the same, that the Ouroboros fertilizes itself and gives birth to herself again, or himself. So this is really the building. It's bigger than that. This is the main building, the hospitality center. But it actually, in the entrance, you will find this on the floor. It says, our temple will draw them to it like a magnet, and in its silence, they will search their souls and find themselves. So that is how it is supposed to be, a place for searching the soul and creating the soul and cultivating the self. Yeah. Oh, no. So I'm going to just mention one plant. We talked about the consciousness of plants, and I fully subscribe to it, particularly in relation to the Egyptian blue lotus that is almost extinct, but we managed in New Hermopolis to grow it, albeit being extremely difficult, and there is a strong demand on it. But this, as you can see, it is an amazing flower because it defies gravity. It defies everything. It comes out from the water, from a sunken, dormant state with the sunrise, and with sunset, it goes deep down in the water again, to the extent that you don't see any evidence of flower on the surface of the water. And it grows from static water. It has to be static. It grows from muddy water. It has to be muddy. So out of the dirt, out of what is static, comes dynamism, comes a purity, comes a beauty, comes even the ultimate sublime thing you can ever come across. It's so beautiful. And of course, that is the reason why probably the ancient Egyptian, and that's the reason we know very little about it till now, because this was a big secret for the ancient Egyptians. They put a lot of emphasis on the lotus. And even in the Book of the Dead, or the spell for being transformed into a lotus, a human being is being transformed into a lotus, being aware of the lotus consciousness. I am this lotus which went forth from the sunshine. I have descended that I may ascend to seek thee. I am the pure who issued from the fen or the mud. So, and this is my book, which actually I say, among others, it's not only Jung, a group of people that I call, because as a psychiatrist, I call myself a cultural psychiatrist, but also I am an existential psychiatrist because I'm interested in existential philosophy, because it gives you power over your existence. But I say that influenced by the Hermetic idea, Jung was able to see the conflicting divisions of our world today as mirroring the psychological chaos within our souls. To resolve these divisions, we need to learn how to reconcile and integrate those chaotic fragments and achieve the cohesion and oneness of the self of the world, which was the first oneness. So this is what we are seeking throughout our life, which is again is like the combined two hemispheres. I mean, it's of the brain. I mean, it is the wholeness has to be this combination and this fusion. The last thing about consciousness is about world consciousness that we are seeking. If only a worldwide consciousness could arise, that all division and all fission are due to the splitting of the opposites in the psyche, then we should know where to begin. Thank you very much.
All right, so let me go ahead and jump in. So the name of my presentation for today is Consciousness in the Traditions of Ancient Egypt, Lessons for Today. So I'll start off by just describing a little bit of who I am, since most people probably are not familiar with me or my work. So as was mentioned earlier, I'm the co-founder and co-executive director, along with my collaborator, Michaela Wuna, of Rainbow Serpent. And we're a nonprofit organization based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that seeks to advance Black LGBTQ culture through the exploration of traditional African spirituality, multimedia art, and emerging tech. And we do this by working in a wide variety of mediums. So one of our most recent projects, the screen's a little dark, but you can see, hopefully, is a project called Myth Science of the Gatekeepers, which is a series of 16 glass sculptures. An example you can see on the right of these Black, queer, ancient Egyptian deities. Hapi being one of these figures, who was the personification of the Nile River, was imagined as a man, but you could also see with large breasts and a pregnant stomach, making this figure the first, I would argue, androgynous deity in human history. Another example is this figure Khonsu, who is a deity of the moon and of introspective states. Along with that project, we released a virtual reality film called Black Star Sanctuary, which was this 16-minute exploration of this expansive temple space that houses these megalithic versions of the statues from the previous project. Also done other kinds of film projects, such as Obiumbu, the Primordial House, which is based on a Nigerian Igbo myth about these two androgynous deities who create the world through dance. The sequel to that project was one called The Four World Ages, which also was working with this archive of Igbo myth, thinking about the unfolding of human history from this era of divine unity, where human beings are directly created to or connected to the Creator, all the way to our current age of chaos. So this project manifested as photography, also live performance. Also done other kinds of public art installations. This was a piece, a 1,200 square foot billboard called Playing the Cosmic Strings, which again was interested in thinking about African myths and what they might contribute to thinking about the origin of music in a project for the symphony. Of course, that also has led to other kinds of public workshops and educational endeavors trying to think about how to be an advocate for these traditions. This is an image from Esalen and a workshop that I gave there called Harnessing the Power of Creation Through African Ritual. So that's just a quick summary of some of the different kinds of projects that I work on. But for today, I will be doing a close reading of this text, The Book of Knowing, The Evolutions of Ra, and of Overthrowing Apep. So we don't really know when the text was written. There are a lot of different dates around when it might have been composed. I've seen dates as early as 2500 BC, and it's an outrageous text actually, but one filled with all kinds of cognitive complexity, aesthetic splendor, and spiritual wisdom, and it really provides what I call an original and originating narrative of origins. And that is because it is really trying to think about the origin of the universe, but I think the outrageousness of the text comes from the fact that you get the narrative of the universe speaking about their origins, and I'm using there for a very specific reason, in their own voice. And you get this idea of this living, organic, conscious universe whose self-consciousness is then the catalyst for all future developments. And following on what Jeff was saying yesterday, it really is the super story of superstories, if you will. And I guess if you also allow me the hyperbole, I would say from my perspective, I think it really is the most fascinating account of relaying the most important story in the history of the cosmos, which is the actual history and origin of the cosmos. And of course, inspired by Cutworth and the talks about these humble titles, one alternate title for this talk today is the unified field theory of all theories, all sciences, all arts, and all gnosis. So we'll see if that is humble enough. All right, so I'll start by just presenting the text because I'm sure most people here in the room are not familiar with it. And I really will only have time to unpack little bits of it because it's so rich and dense with information. But you will see that many of the themes that are everywhere in the study of consciousness, whether from philosophy, biology, linguistics, et cetera, are here in an embryonic form in this particular text. So I'll read some of it, and then I'll have to skip some of it because it gets a little long, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so we have the Book of Knowing, the Evolutions of Ra, and keep track this figure here, this dung beetle or scarab that you'll see repeated throughout the text. So the Book of Knowing, the Evolutions of Ra, and of Overthrowing Apep. Apep is this sign for chaos and dissolution, again, imagined by this figure who's stabbing himself in the head with an axe. Okay, so the words of, right, it's a very, very vibrant kind of image. The words of Nebuchadnezzar, which he spake after he came into being. I am he who came into being in the form of Khepri. I was or became the creator of what came into being, the creator of all what came into being. After my coming into being, many were the things which came into being coming forth from my mouth. Not existed heaven, not existed earth, not had been created the things of the earth, i.e. plants and creeping things in that place. I raised up them from out of new, the primeval abyss of water, from a state of inactivity. Not found I a place I could stand wherein. I worked a charm upon my heart, or with my heart. It's a very interesting duality there. I laid a foundation in Ma'ah, or absolute truth, or the absolute law, and I made every attribute. I was alone, for not had I spit in the form of Shu, not had I emitted Tefnut, not existed another who worked with me. I made a foundation in my own heart, and there came into being the multitudes of things which came into being, of the things which came into being, from out of the things which came into being of births, from out of the things which came into being of their births. I, even I, had union with my clenched hand. I joined myself in an embrace with my shadow. I poured seed into my own mouth. I sent forth issue in the form of Shu. I sent forth moisture in the form of Tefnut. So I'll skip down a little bit, so we won't have time to unpack all of this, but for me, after I became from one God, three gods, or from God, one gods, three, that is from out of myself, and after I came into being in this earth, were raised up therefore Shu and Tefnut in the inert watery mass wherein they were. They brought to me my eye in their train. After therefore I had united my members, I wept over them, and came into being men and women from the tears which came forth from my eye. just to skip ahead a little bit. Okay, so give birth Shu and Tefnut to Geb and Nut, give birth Geb and Nut to Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, Nephthys from the womb. One after the other of them, they give birth and they multiply in this earth. And so, okay, so we get this idea of this creation that's morphing, that's emerging, that's differentiating itself. So needless to say, the text itself is not static. So there's multiple versions of the text that tell this creation story. And so I wanted to also just give you a few excerpts from another version of this constantly emerging and morphing text, which is describing this morphing and emerging reality. So I was or became the creator of what came into being. I came into being in the forms of Khepri, coming into being in primeval time. So I came into being in the forms of Khepri. I was the creator of what came into being. That is to say, I produced myself from the primeval matter which I made. I produced myself. I brought into my own mouth my own name. That is to say, a word of power. And I, even I, came into being in the form of things which came into being. I think we're kind of getting a little bit of the point. And I came into being in the forms of Khepri. I came into being from the primeval matter. So Shu and Tefnut give birth to Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, Nephthys, and behold their children, they create beings manifold in earth. This from the beings of children, from the beings of their children, they invoke my name, they overthrow their enemies, they create words of power for the overthrow of Apep. Okay, so let's just kind of go into a little bit on what this means and what it might say about, or have to say about our understanding of consciousness. But before we do that, I do have to give a quick note on the hieroglyphic language, mainly because our approaches to consciousness, of course, are influenced by the conceptual apparatus that we're using, by the language that we're using. And so hieroglyphic language really opens up a window to think about and understand consciousness in a very particular way. So the glyphs are not only narrating or providing a certain kind of narrative content, but it's also embodying a very complex and integrated view of consciousness itself. So on one hand, we have this idea of symbolic density. So every glyph is not just a phonetic symbol, just a sound, but every glyph is also an embodiment and carrying a wide range of cultural and cosmic significance. And I'll try to give you an example of how this density works by taking one or two and pulling them out for you. But it suggests that consciousness has multi-layers in a similar way. This idea that consciousness is really embodied through sensory, emotional, intellectual, spiritual components all at the same time. You have an interconnectedness of symbols. So one interesting thing about how the text works is that every symbol, because each word can be spelled with a variety of hieroglyphic symbols. So each symbol that is chosen is specifically chosen to reflect or nuance the meaning of other symbols that is laid out next to. So meaning is constantly shifting and turning and twisting even as the text is unfolding. And so not only are the glyphs in reference to each other and shading their own meanings, but they're also drawing meaning from the natural world and the intellectual world, the world of rituals and culture into the text as well. So for instance, if you have a glyph of an insect, all of the biological data about that insect becomes relevant to the reading of the text. All of the connotations of that insect also become relevant to the reading of the text. If a deity is mentioned, all of the ritual practice and mantras and cultural apparatuses associated with that figure are also kind of working through the text as well. So again, you get this idea of consciousness as nonlinear, as web-like, and bringing all of these different ideas and components together. We have this blending of visual, or this visual and conceptual synthesis. So basically, again, each glyph is going to give you a mix of pictorial and textual elements. So you're activating both hemispheres of the brain because you're thinking about images, but then you're also thinking about words. So you're getting this integration of form and meaning, and also because the creator themselves is creating the world, including human beings, and human beings are then using the forms of the natural world to write and communicate. We're getting the sense that consciousness is both the experiencer and the experienced, and there's a very interesting interplay between these different moments. Hieroglyphics are interesting because they can be written in multiple ways. So they can be written from right to left, but also from left to right, and also from top to bottom. So this is a very different understanding of dimensionality, of temporality, You're going forwards and backwards in time. You're thinking about movement from higher dimensions to lower dimensions, just through looking at the text. So again, you're already thinking about consciousness in a multi-dimensional, multilinear, multi-temporal kind of way. So I wanted to flag that just before we even get to the reading of the text, because we're already starting to get ideas about what the text means just from how it's written. So the main idea I want you all to walk away with is that in this text, you are given this idea about the universe as this living conscious entity. So this idea of I am he who came into being in the form of Khepri. So even there we have to stop, because there really is no temporal limit on the unfolding of this universe. So it is, I was he who came into being in the past. It's kind of in the present, I am he who comes into being, but also it's a continual process. So I am he who will be coming into being. So all of these kind of temporal dimensions are happening at the same time. So this universe is this fluid, diverse, very self-aware being that is constantly moving through all kinds of temporal registers. Already, even in that too, I mean, you can see that there really is no subject-object divide, because even just through reading the text, you're enacting the text, participating in the text, and extending the text. So even just by reading the text out loud, I am he who came into being in the form of Khepri. I really am saying, me personally, Marques Redd, I am the person who came into being in the form of this being. So we have a text that serves as this open portal, if you will, so that we're not just understanding intellectually the development of the universe and its consciousness, but also participating in the expansion of it as well. Okay, so just a little bit more to unpack here. This word Nebuchadnezzar, who's the name given to the creator, the name translates, or one translation of it could be the Lord of all, the master of all. But I think to really understand it is more, I would say, a system of systems. And what we're getting here is a system philosophy and a system process. So Nebuchadnezzar is a blend, a mix of unmanifest reality, what in other contexts I call the primordial androgynous blackness, because it's an area of reality that has no form, no shape, no definition, but is this unmanifest reality, kind of like the implicate order that gives birth or gives rise to manifest reality. And manifest reality always maintains its connection to unmanifest reality, and it's the morphing and differentiation of unmanifest reality that gives birth to the manifest world. Okay, so we have this Nebuchadnezzar, this kind of system of systems that comes into being in the form of Khepri. So again, Khepri means transformation, means evolution. So I am the figure who comes into existence as becoming itself, as evolution itself. I have no form but the process of constant moving. Khepri also is a very interesting figure to be chosen for this phrase. So as we saw earlier, Khepri is the dung beetle. Okay, so what is a dung beetle? So the dung beetle collects these balls of manure left by larger animals on the savanna, plants eggs in them, so when the eggs hatch, the larvae have a food source. So already we're getting this idea of the emergence of life from abject material, from waste material. Waste becomes a product of new life, of the divine. So you could say I am he who comes into being in the form of recycling life, in the form of creating life from waste. Let's see, Khepri also, as was said earlier, was analogized to the movement of the sun, because you would see these little insects pushing these balls of waste. So people thought that that was kind of like the sun moving across the sky. So it's already giving us symbolic ideas of death and resurrection, endings and beginnings, the kind of daily cycles of life. So we could also read this, I am he who came into being in the form of daily cycles. I am he who comes into being as the cycles of death and resurrection. I am he who comes into being as the form of renewal. So all of those meanings are embedded here. Okay, so we could also move forward in time and think about, let's say, something like the Mandelbrot fractal, if you all are familiar with this. So this image of the beetle, well, it looks like a beetle, but the more you zoom into it, the more it maintains its shape, self-similarly on each level. So you can zoom into it, you can zoom out of it, and this kind of beetle shape remains. So this is really a symbol of becoming. So one kind of definition or reading, you could say, I am he who comes into being in the form of fractal infinity. I am he who comes into being in the form of being able to zoom into reality infinitely and finding reality repeated again and again. So this is kind of how this text works. But what you're getting is this idea of consciousness as an inherent universal property. It is really a precursor or prefiguration of certain forms of panpsychism, which we talked about earlier. But I would say it transcends panpsychism in some other respects as well. But you get this very interesting idea of this unity of the creator. I am he who came into being, the creation, the forms of being that emerge from the creator but are still connected to the creator, and the act of creation, which is the self-consciousness that gives birth to creation. Okay, so then the text then tries to explain, okay, so how do we get from this cosmic scale down to our earthly reality, down to our human dimension? And there's this process of emanation. So the cosmos has to emanate from within itself in stages, the material world. So the text then tries to describe how that process happens whilst keeping us connected to this original plenitude to get the structure of what we see every day. So the text says, I poured seed into my own mouth, and then I sent forth issue in the form of shu, sent forth moisture in the form of tefnut. So these terms, shu and tefnut, are usually translated by Egyptologists as air and moisture, but from a different perspective, we can think of them as expansive and contractive forces. Basically, this duality that emerges that becomes necessary for the emergence of a manifest reality. And it's this duality that then provides a framework for the material world to come into being. So you have this idea about, almost like a yin and a yang kind of idea around this kind of nothingness that's also an everythingness that kind of dualizes its potential so that reality can come into existence. And this kind of duality, or this play between what I say is duality, polarity, relationality, and unity. So basically you have these two opposites that are still interdependent and interconnected. They still are unified through emerging from never chair. And the relationship between these forces are what propels this qualitative changes in the emergence of reality. And this kind of duality is repeated again on every stage of existence as we get closer and closer to the material world. And that's the duality that we would see, I would say, even in the brain hemispheres in this dualization, which is repeating the earliest dualization that happens as the universe emerges. Okay, so then it continues. Shu and Tefnut were therefore raised up in the inert watery mass wherein they were. So again, this kind of unmanifest reality, this level of potential. They brought to me my eye in their train. So the eye here, of course, is a symbol for visual awareness, the emergence of consciousness, but also the eye is a solar eye. Representing the sun, of course, the emanations of the sun, the tears of the sun provide the foundation for life. After, therefore, I had united my members, I wept over them, and men and women came into being from the tears. Okay, so on one hand, by thinking about humans as tears from the divine, we have this idea about human beings being the same substance as the divine, that the larger cosmic being is kind of mirrored in human being. We have this idea kind of expressed here about consciousness as the formation or the kind of almost the side product of divine sorrow and joy. So the tears of grief, knowing that, of course, bringing life into the world is going to also bring into the world these cycles of death and destruction. But of course, tears of joy, because it also brings into existence the opposite as well. And of course, we have this orgasmic understanding of the world. The world is literally an ejaculation of the creator. So these tears of joy also are kind of related to that erotic element that's embedded in the world as well. Of course, we also have an idea here about the role of emotion in the emergence of consciousness. Again, thinking about human beings as tears of the divine. And of course, this comes with many different types of existential implications as well. So if human beings are of the same substance as the divine, the idea in this text is that it's not only going to give us a map from the unmanifest reality to the reality that we exist in, but it's also going to try to give us a map of the return. So this idea that as being connected to the creator, we basically have the goal and the responsibility of being let's say a mechanism or a vehicle for the creator to experience the creation from within creation. And so the idea becomes we are going to try to spiritualize and elevate ourselves so that we could be a vehicle, a divinized vehicle for the creator to experience this creation. Okay, so once we get this original duality, this duality then becomes replicated on many different levels as we get closer and closer to our everyday world. So we get in this narrative an allegory of the unfolding of human and divine faculties. So basically these faculties are coming out of Nebuchadnezzar and providing almost, I would say, a matrix of sort, a metaphysical matrix for the elements of the physical world to come into existence. So we have this paradigm of Shu and Tefnut. So on one hand, air and moisture, expansive and contractive energy. Also can think of this dualism here as the original dualism between consciousness and energy matter. So this dual pair gives birth to another dual pair, Geb and Nut, again, usually thought of as the earth and the sky, but we could think a little more allegorically about the earth being a symbol of the phenomenal realm, the realm of everyday objects, things, the things that we see, whereas this sky deity is kind of a metaphysical or noumenal realm where you have ideas, spirits, kind of immaterial objects that still have a certain kind of reality. And then this duality presents and provides additional deities or faculties that again provide a hanging or infrastructure for the world to emerge. So we have a figure like Osiris, who really symbolizes wisdom and spiritual power, but particularly the wisdom that comes through understanding death and resurrection. Isis, which is a faculty of nurturing. Again, it's a divine faculty because you need a faculty of nurturing for the world itself to grow and for the things of the world to develop. But then we also have, as human beings, the same faculty, this talent within ourselves of being able to nurture and particularly to be devoted to the idea of becoming a divine being. So all of these other faculties, Horus, a faculty of personal will, divine law. Set is this kind of element of chaos from certain angles, but then a separative intellect from another. And then we have this final figure who is a faculty of imagination. So again, this is also a thinking about how consciousness is also embedded in the natural world at each stage of the unfolding of the natural world. And then we can think of this narrative not just, therefore, as an allegory of the unfolding of divine faculties, but as an allegory of the unfolding of the material world itself. So just as the faculties come into being in a very structured way, and again, we have to think of this as a systems theory, where you have these co-acting multiple factors that are kind of polyrhythmically interacting with each other in order for these matrices to continue to unfold. So again, we can kind of think about the same narrative. Nebuchadnezzar giving birth to Shu and Tefnut, again, a duality we could think of as dark energy and dark matter. That duality, again, brings us closer to the earth. So we have Geb, this earth deity, we can think of as the hydrosphere and lithosphere, Nut as the atmosphere that surrounds and contains the earth, and then these additional 5 faculties or deities as representative of the biosphere. So let's say Osiris being a representative of all these processes of growth and decay that you find in nature, Set being a symbol of ecological chaos and disruption, Horus being a symbol of order and regulation, and the patterns of order that you find in nature, et cetera. So again, the text is providing a map that can read and understand consciousness as it's unfolding in many different ways. But then, of course, if we bring back the fractal image from the beginning, we could think about this pattern of deities and this Aeneid, which was the word given earlier, as something that provides the structure of every single level. So the more you, let's say, drill into dark energy, you could find a repetition of this whole tree and pattern within that particular level. So again, all of these things are moving and morphing and working all at once. And so because of that, we could think of this text as really an anchor text. So it provides a map, again, of the way of unfolding and re-emerging that brings together all different kinds of understandings, myths, rituals, etc. And because this is a model of completeness and divine self-sufficiency, there's nothing that can actually be theorized outside of this world. So for that reason, and to make it more relevant for this particular conference, we can think of this narrative as also providing us an allegory for theories of consciousness as well. And thinking about these deities as providing the panoply of positions that one can take to understand how consciousness itself emerges. So thinking about, again, this figure of Shu, who represents the air and these expansive forces, you could think about that position as giving you a model of consciousness as fundamentally an expansive space of awareness, this kind of workstation or workspace kind of theory in which thoughts and perceptions occur. Tefnut will be kind of the opposite, where consciousness is a force that brings cohesion and order to perceptual and material chaos. And I would say maybe the perspective that we've heard the most in this conference would be represented by this earth god or this earth deity, which will be consciousness as a sensory-based phenomenon grounded in the physical body, the brain, the empirical world. We have the sky deity Nut, which would be a sign for consciousness, I would say maybe in Kundalini experience, so this condensation of these transcendental experiences that reveal the expansive potential of the mind. So again, these mythical narratives are a kind of science in the sense that they provide a full landscape for understanding the creativity, the flow, the emergence, this kind of profusion of divine plenitude into the world. And we can actually think of this as a kind of emergentism, again, because we're getting an emergence and an additional complexity as you move through these levels that are outlined by the text. And again, I won't go into all of these, but we could, if people have questions about how this allegory works, I would just say, this figure of Osiris, because it deals with a lot with death and resurrection, we could think about theories of consciousness that engage with topics like reincarnation, which we haven't really talked about so much in this conference, and about how consciousness might survive after death. Or I would say this idea of artificial intelligence would probably fit with this figure of Set, who represents the syllogistic separative intellect. Okay, so just to kind of keep moving here, just kind of outline a few other quick themes that you can find embedded in this text. So there's this idea of the living word as a creative force. So the words of Nebuchadnezzar, which he spoke after he came into being. It's not an unfamiliar idea. Okay, so I'll move even more quickly. Okay, so we talked a little bit about cosmological origins and the way in which the word sets a precedence for the unfolding of the cosmological world. I won't go through much here, but I will say another particular way to read this text is from a genetic perspective. So the words of Nebuchadnezzar, which he spoke after he came into being, could also refer to the genetic word. So we know the genetic code is, ATCG. So how could we think about, again, this is another way in which we see the profusion and the expansion of divine consciousness. Okay, so I'll just move through here, just again, to say this piece around I had union with my clenched hand, I joined myself in an embrace with my shadow. We could see this whole moment as really the first ritual, this kind of specific moment where the creator themselves engages in ritual to bring the world into creation. So anytime we then engage in ritual practice, we are reproducing this original autoerotic ritual that provided the space for creation to emerge in the first place. So if I had more time, I would kind of talk about the way in which, therefore, ritual and art can be thought about not just as pieces of aesthetic expression, but as important methodological tools for understanding consciousness and how it works, and how to use art and ritual as a mode to manifest and provoke divine consciousness. Okay, and then finally, to wrap it up, there's this idea that this text is not just our ancient origin, but speaks to our future destiny as well. So thinking about the text from the perspective of the writer, of the priest, it kind of talks about, again, the goal of human life. So the idea is that one is trying to elevate one's consciousness enough so that one can be a vehicle to write the text. So there's a way in which, through spiritual practice and development, one becomes the reader of nature so that you can see how divine consciousness is expressed through all of the different natural forces and the natural panoply of the world. But you're also becoming a divine writer because you're actually writing the text of the words of the universe and kind of transposing those words into a human form, while at the same time reproducing and recreating creation while doing that. So there are a lot of interesting recursive loops in the way in which the text is also kind of calling us from the future to become elevated enough so that we can write the text itself. So there's a lot of interesting plays there. But I will really end, so talking about how the word is not just supposed to be theorized about, but the word is supposed to be danced, painted, and sung. So one project that I worked on was a music project where I composed a song that set this text to music. And a friend of mine performed it, who was a model for one of the sculptures. And so I'll end by just 2 minutes of that, if I can. If we can hear it. Okay. Congrats.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Mervat. We will soon open it up to questions and comments. And I'm going to kick us off with a question that will attempt to integrate some of the previous panels with what we've just heard. So I think on the first day when we had the panel on consciousness within and beyond the brain, I asked a question about the Platonic frame. And I'll make this, I hope will be clear why I'm going to kind of re-ask this question. Much of what we discuss, it seems, when we discuss consciousness in the contemporary idiom is this phenomenal sort of self-awareness. And yet, what I asked yesterday, was it yesterday? How many days have we been here? Was that for the Neoplatonic frame, that level of self-aware consciousness is a fairly low level of consciousness, and that there is a kind of unconscious consciousness slumbering in the aware consciousness. Now, the reason I ask that, or return to that phrase, is I heard something similar in both presentations. So is there a kind of, to borrow the language of Jung and others, unconscious consciousness that is slumbering, that needs to be reawakened? What are the stakes of reawakening that slumbering consciousness for our self-aware consciousness? And what does that have to do with a kind of non-duality at the origins of consciousness? So that gets to the creation story. Now, this is actually a question motivated by a fellow Egyptian who you mentioned, who is Plotinus. Right? So Plotinus has this idea that there's a kind of non-duality at the source of all, and yet our consciousness is a kind of occluded or blind version of consciousness that we need to bring, which we need to awaken so that it can kind of consciously interact with that non-duality. Does that question make any sense to you too?
It does. It does.
Okay, you need a mic though.
Although I actually think that Marcus is probably better than me in replying to this, I actually believe, yes, there is a conscious unconsciousness. And that's why when I looked at the structure of the Hermetic with the Jungian, I mentioned something awaiting integration. It's also awaiting discovering, or awaiting that this unconscious conscious is not yet we are not yet aware of, we are not yet awake enough to detect or to know. And this is what Jung actually said something about active imagination. There is hard work on our part of the pursuit of knowledge. So through noses, you actually come across the archetypes and all the symbolism and all the hard work that you mentioned so beautifully, the allegory itself. So to decipher this allegory and to understand the mystery of creation according to ancient Egyptian mythology, that requires hard work on our part, because it's all allegory and it is all humanity is part of the creative process. We are the envoy of God on earth. We are collaborator or co-creator, and creation doesn't end. We are a creative project till the last day of our life, because being and the continuing of being and becoming are one and the same thing. So this is really in a nutshell what it is. So it requires this gnosis and active imagination, and this is the hard work on our part, which is part of the creative process.
Yeah, so I would say I probably would have needed more time to explain this part of the text, but there's a whole theory of what is existing before creation happens. So there's all of these things like not existed heaven, not existed earth, but things were still happening even though it was a period of non-existence. And there are whole other cosmological frameworks, like the one from Hermopolis, that is explicitly a theorization of the existence before creation and this kind of, not really stasis, but this infinite potential and dormancy that you have to have there for the world itself to come into existence, because nothing is coming out of complete nothing, because even nothingness is full, if that makes sense.
Yeah. May I just yeah. Yes, it's very good that you mentioned the Hermopolitan myth, because I've actually deliberately didn't talk too much about it, and it is the Ogdoad. And Simon yesterday talked about the Tibetan and talked about the air, earth, water, and fire. These are exactly the four primordial forces. They are the non-existence. They are the elemental ones. They are the ones that not yet being. So the not yet existence, there is quite a lot of narrative about it in ancient Egyptian mythology. And you mentioned something very interesting about that earth is existence or being, air is breathing, and water is living, and fire is transmutation, or alchemy is the transformation. The Egyptians, even in the Ogdoad, which are the 8 primordial forces, they are these 4, but they are dually gendered. And they chose, you mentioned something about the frog, for instance. The frog is actually there as well. They chose the frog and the snake because they are not ultimate beings. They are metamorphic beings. They are subliminal. They are not yet finished. And in fact, in ancient Egyptian mythology, nothing is yet finished. So there is a kind of a continuing dynamic process, which that's why I said something about the two cerebral hemispheres. There is this one, which you can call it dual gender, because for quite a long time, the right hemisphere was connected with the feminine side of nature. So in many ways, it is the dynamic, it's the imaginative, it is the conceptualizing, it's the uncertain, the fluidity, all these things that actually continuing into existence or trying to exist. So existence is a quest. You are in that's why I'm saying life in ancient Egyptian terminology is a strife. He says when a strife hasn't existed. So once you are into life, you begin the strife. So, and it is up to you. And that's, I think, this is the existential aspect of it, that you bring your own existence and you shape it and you create it.
I think we should probably open it up. Questions or comments? I see Rachel's hand, so we'll go first to Rachel.
Thank you both so much. I wish we had more time for each of you. And Marques, I'm new to this text, so I'm looking forward to spending more time with it. My question is actually for Mervat. So I confess that my understanding of the Hermetica is very influenced by the historian of religion and the esotericist Walter Hanegraaff in the Netherlands. So you can tell me that what I'm about to say is entirely wrong, because it's very influenced by his understanding that the ultimate telos of the Hermetica, so all of these sort of everything in the toolkit, alchemy, moral cultivation, all of it is pointed towards this goal of self-deification. So in the Hermetica, you are making yourself a god. And one faculty that's very important for that is nous, getting back to the question that Charlie posed, which is this very difficult to translate term, which is both that which knows, the faculty which knows, and that which is known. And so I guess the question I'm driving at is sort of, is there a risk of flattening this sort of vertical ontology of the Hermetica by comparing it to Jung, and I don't know as much about Jung, whereas for him, you know, the goal is the unification of consciousness, which is very different than turning yourself into a god. So I'm wondering what is gained and what is lost in that comparison between nous and Jung's consciousness.
Well, if I understood it correctly, there is no separation as such. There is a kind of complementarity, so they are part and parcel of each other. So they said you cannot actually talk about nous by itself and then the cosmos. It is all related in many ways and interconnected in many ways. Am I touching on what you wanted or not really?
I think so. Maybe just to be more simple, my understanding of the Hermetica, again, might be wrong, is that it is a set of practices and texts which point to the possibility that humans can turn ourselves into gods, which means we are no longer beholden to fate, we are no longer beholden to the vagaries of the body. And I think Jung's project is a little different. It's sort of more mental, if you will. It's a unification of mind, which is very different from tapping into divine mind. So yeah, I guess I'm just trying to understand what's gained and what's lost in that comparison. But maybe Charlie can help me reiterate if that's not clear.
Well, in a way, it is the divine is the ultimate destination you aspire to, which, according to Jung, as I said, is the identification with the divine savior. So you become one with God, which is very much like most of the spiritual traditions. You are internalizing God inside you, but this is a process, and it's an ongoing process, and not everyone is able to reach it. It requires really hard work on our part, which, if I can quote Nietzsche in this respect, is this kind of the making of the Übermensch that he actually uses in the end the symbol of the caduceus in a way, which has got an eagle as well as a snake, which is the symbol of Hermes. So we are all the time between the two, between flying and getting into our heavenly destination, and being tied down to earthy things. So it is a conflict, and it is a strife, and it is a dialectic, and a process. Once you start into getting the two together, you are constantly becoming a third, and the third get into another dialectic, and so on and so forth. So this is how evolution happens. But it's also more than evolution. And may I mention something like the ever-present origin by Gipser, for instance, that we can incorporate all times and all places in one go. And this is very much an Egyptian mythology, that you can live in different domains, and you are conscious of different times, the past, the present, even let's say something in the Hermetica. You have to imagine yourself dead and buried. So it is this thing of the continuum of birth to after death. So death is not finality, it's not an end. So this is and this is the beauty about it. That's why I call it existential, because it is an ongoing work.
So Natalia is next, and then Yuria.
Thank you. So this kind of follows the way that you just answered Rachel's question, though I was originally going to direct the question at Marques. Oh, sorry. Originally going to direct the question at Marques, but I think if both of you could speak a bit more on the theory of reincarnation within the cosmology, and how that relates to consciousness, memory, and becoming, and if there is a sense of memory within reincarnation within the texts.
Yeah, so I would say one of the interesting things about this particular text is that it provides a map, like I said, that is a model of divine completion and self-sufficiency. And so reincarnation is thought about within the model. So I would say that figure of Osiris would be the figure through whom those dynamics would play out. So, and to really understand that, you have to kind of know all of the narratives, all the stories around this particular deity or this particular divine faculty. But the main piece of it is that he's killed by his brother and is kind of put back together and comes back to life. And so that really is a sign of a kind of death and resurrection. So I would say the dynamic of reincarnation is kind of embedded into the system. And there has to be a certain kind of death, because one would not engage in the process of deifying oneself or doing the work of elevating one's consciousness if one did not have a certain kind of internal limit that one would die. But then that internal limit is not a final limit, because the world is still emerging and pulsing and morphing into being. So I would say those dynamics, because there's nothing outside of the system of systems, then death and resurrection has to be an integral part of that model as well.
Yuria.
As a weaver of worlds, I'll also try to weave the questions just in the lookout for some more commentary. But I mentioned yesterday about the literalization of textual in Abrahamic traditions. So in this case, also following with what Rachel was looking perhaps, the problem of hubris in the inflation when texts are literalized instead of individuation. So what would be then also the dangers of that?
Could you try to say that again? So you see there's a danger in literalization of texts, and you were, am I right, you were saying you didn't see that with this text?
No, absolutely not. I mentioned yesterday what the problem is of hubris when literalizing the Abrahamic text. In this case, I think it is the same problem, the same great danger when perhaps there would be an inflation with an identification of self and God, or the divine, instead of self for looking for individuation, right? So the dangers of hubris for I am God rather than I am individuating and finding myself as part of a community that is divine.
Yeah, so I would say there's probably, I will probably try to clarify what God means in this case. So the actual word that you see in ancient Egyptian for God or the deity is the word neter, usually spelled N-E-T-E-R. So you can already hear a similarity between that neter, that root, and nature. So God is not a separate being, is not a different isolated thing that's different from creation. So saying I am God in this case is not necessarily meaning I am the inflated ego, but I am the system. I am the kind of process. I mean, so the text is saying, I mean, I come into being as evolution. I come into being as infinite possibility and infinite branching out. So it's not necessarily saying I have dominion, but I am the infinite capacity to be.
Absolutely, yeah, that's what I was trying to point, which is what Jung is trying to say as well, looking for individuation. So being a self as part of a community,
Sure, absolutely.
rather being the self as one single separate divine.
But one still has
which
to
is what
have,
hubris would be pointed at.
right, but I would say, but still, I think the text has a telos though in forcing us to have that realization though, because it's not immediately apparent that we would have this understanding of ourselves as part of world process. So there still is a kind of a process that one has to undergo in order to have the epiphany that you are part of the all, if you will, if that makes sense. So it's not just a given, it's not something that we're necessarily born with, but it's the purpose of life to realize how connected we are to life.
Yes, I think this is exactly the same argument about Nietzsche's Übermensch, that we are seeking power and we are going to be kind of godly creatures, and that's not at all. It is actually, I entirely agree with Marcus. It is a very long process, and it goes even after one's death. In fact, after one's death is more important than one's life, because you live by extension, you live by your creativity, you live in posterity, you leave your creativity behind on earth. So that's your stamp on earth. That's your what shows that you contributed to the existence of life itself. So it has nothing really to do with power. This is the literal, and I can see that, of course, in our superficial age and literal age, we don't see the allegorical aspects and the metaphorical aspects. The whole of Egyptian philosophical thinking is about how you read it. And it's open to several interpretations, and it is symbolic. Yeah, it is like poetry. So, and take it or leave it, and that's why I pay a lot of attention to mythology, because mythology is the only antidote to rigidity of thought. Because you can rubbish it, you can not accept it, anything. I mean, look at what I agree with you. I mean, what happened in the Olympics, and people thought that in Paris that it was the Last Supper, and it was actually the festival of the gods in the Olympics, and it was it is purely Greek mythology, and it goes with the Olympics. So, and yet, People perceive what they want to perceive, and it is this reductionism, it is a superficial way of looking at things, although it is metaphorical. You can read it the way you want to read it. So this is the danger we can get, and I accept that there is a danger.
Yeah,
okay,
back
thanks.
to this conference specifically, I mean, it's an idea that the world itself is a tissue of symbols. And consciousness is basically creating and interpreting symbols and thinking about not reality in a static sense, but this kind of fluid, imaginal, multidimensional world. I mean, so if you see reality itself as a network of organized icons, divine icons, then your understanding of consciousness is already coming into a different place.
We have time for one last question, and it's going to be from Elizabeth.
So I'm sorry to break the rule of it not exactly being a question, but it kind of is a question. But Rachel, when you were saying, I've never read the Hermetica, but what you were talking about and this idea of becoming God, it makes me think of, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, of the guru deity yoga, and you are imagining becoming a god, but not becoming a god to be powerful and rule, but the paradox of becoming God is about being of service, and it's about humility, and it's about interconnection. And I don't know if that's what you were talking about in the Hermetica or not, but that's what came to my mind. And sorry, this idea of being of service has come up a couple of times in outside conversations, and I just think that it's a beautiful thing to remark and remember.
Could I try to just paraphrase that and integrate it with some of the other comments, that maybe we can think about deification or becoming a god, not as sole dominion, but as becoming a co-creator in community. So I wonder if that sounds faithful to the tradition you've spoken out of. Thank you for your comments and questions, and thank you, Marques and Mervat, so much.